guys, welcome to week 3 of the Ecclesiastes to Grow series. So we're going to do things a little bit differently today, just to try to avoid getting to a 25-30 minute video, which I know can be very long. And so I'm still going to zoom in and show you guys my observation page in my workbook, but I'm actually going to walk you through a little bit of how I might go about leading a class as far as what kind of types of observation questions that I'm personally asking in my study that I would invite my class in to consider, and hopefully just hopefully that will just even show you a little bit more behind the scenes of where my mind is at when I'm making observations and things like that. And so grab your Bible, grab your scripture journal, pull up Ecclesiastes chapter 3, and let's get started. So the first chunk of chapter 3 has this poem in it, and so I'm just going to dive right into this. So I'm going to walk you through what this could look like. So something with poetry that we want to be careful with is not to get lost in the weeds. Yes, sometimes with poetry, it can be the poets and sages usually use concrete images in the world to get across a point, to get across an emotion, a tone. And so rather than spending too much time on each individual verse or cola in the poem and trying to figure out, okay, was there a certain significance of planting and plucking up that I need to know about? What I would do is actually zoom out of the whole poem and ask yourself, what is the overlying theme here? What is the repetition here? What is the tone? What is the overarching thing that he's trying to get at with these concrete images? So that is an observable question that I would ask myself as I was reading the poem, rather than spending too much time in each verse. Overall, what is this poem trying to tell me? What emotion is it trying to stir? And does that match up with anything I've already read so far in Ecclesiastes? So that's an example of an observable element that I might make within that first section of chapter 3. Moving forward, some other things that we want to do is we're going to continue looking for repetition. We're going to continue looking for transitional words. So most of Ecclesiastes is discourse, most of it is speech, and then a lot of poetry mixed into that. And so once again, we don't want to get lost in the weeds and miss the force of what he's getting at. What is his argument? What is he trying to get to? And so paying attention to questions, paying attention to transitions that might be answering that question. So things like the phrase so that, or therefore, because, stuff like that. So paying attention to that, paying attention to specific answers. So like, for instance, at the end of verse 13 it says, this is God's gift to man. So that is like a direct like facts that the preacher is trying to get across, and so that's going to be important. So kind of those like direct sentences that is describing something or telling you something as is. You're going to continue to look for themes that you know about Ecclesiastes, that you know about wisdom literature as a whole. So you're going to keep looking for the under the suns, and continue looking for the repetition of things mentioning with time, enjoying the good gifts that God has given you. Some of these things that are repeating itself throughout: fear of the Lord, Genesis themes presenting itself. So you're going to want to highlight those, circle those, whatever you want to do to draw those out of the text. Those are some things that you want to keep looking for. And that's those types of observable elements. You're going to continue to do that through chapter 4. Now, this is where I want to remind you guys that how I am walking you guys through Ecclesiastes, how I have chosen to break it up, is not the only and perfect way. In fact, our church consulted like 5 or 6 different commentaries, and they all broke up Ecclesiastes differently. So it's not a perfect breakup. So sometimes when you're reading Ecclesiastes, it's going to feel like, does this even go together? What is supposed, like, is it actually supposed to go with next week's reading? Stuff like that. It's not going to be perfect. And so chapter 4 kind of feels that way a little bit. It seems to be jumping from topic to topic. And so what I want to invite you to do, again, as an observable element, is to think about themes of what he's talking about, to group some of these verses together. So again, rather than spending too long trying to dissect each and every single verse, try to figure out the bigger pictures that he's trying to get us to. Another thing that I want to point out that is repeated often throughout these 2 chapters is the word better. Better, better, better. So ask interpretive questions about that. Like, why is he talking about something being better? What am I supposed to be getting out of that? And also, what are the better things that he's alluding us to? So those are some types of observable elements that I would encourage you guys to think about and look through, look for as you are reading. As you are reading through Ecclesiastes as a whole. And so start there, and now we will walk through just some ways that you can start to begin to interpret through those observations. Okay, so time for some observations. So I grabbed my BSW, and again, I'm going to do it a little bit differently. Rather than overwhelming you guys with all of my crazy notes on my page, I'm going to briefly walk you guys through some of the things that I had written down, or what I chose to dive into based on my observations, and let you guys do the rest of that work as far as piecing things together. So yeah, so that way I'm not overwhelming you with all of my notes, since this is not supposed to be necessarily an exegesis. So for words and phrases, some of the things that I dove into was season and time. That's a big theme so far in chapters 3 and 4. So who appoints this time? Who appoints this season? What am I supposed to understand specifically of season and time? Task and business are mentioned. So what specifically type of task is it referring to? Is it referring to work? Is it referring to life? Those are some of the questions I want to ask. There's a phrase in there saying made beautiful, something that God is doing. So what does that mean? What is God doing? What is he making into beautiful? Why is he doing it? Eternity is mentioned for the first time in Ecclesiastes, and so why is that being brought up? What do we need to know about it? And then beasts and dust are mentioned later, and so this is very strong language and imagery. So under the sun, what is that supposed to mean? What is he trying to teach us about God and man by using some of these words and some of this imagery? So those are some words and phrases that I chose to write my workbook and to interpret further. Moving on to theology and narrative, and some of this comes from interpreting those words and phrases. So some of the things I had written down that I concluded that would go in this section is that man should not seek meaning in their task, but through it for God, and reminding myself of wisdom literature coming from this perspective that there's a divine cosmic order that is set by God, and when we go against it, it's folly. When we follow it, it is wisdom. And so we need to look to him for purpose and meaning. I'm also writing down some other thoughts that God's enduring and perfect work becomes grounds for worship or fear. So it's not just knowing this, but believing that it matters. So basically, apart from God, our works are inadequate. The idea of driven away, I thought was a theological concept that the fall ruined what God made good. So God is working out his plan to make a new and recover Eden. A better Eden is coming. And so then I also made, I'm starting to see a lot of characteristics about God being drawn out here. And so I made a bracket and a list of some of the God's actions that we're seeing here based on some of the things that the preacher is walking us through. Okay, and then I made a note too that it brings up judgment, which is kind of this final culmination of the poem that he brought up. And so basically he's having us get to this point that because all of Earth's fate is death, that means purpose and meaning and true justice has to come from somewhere else outside of it. So that's something that I went, and then this recognition that there is evil and envy and pursuit after pursuit that too often ends in despair. So kind of asking the preachers, having us ask the question, like, what is our hope? And so again, pointing back to the fact that what God made was good and man ruined it. And so then we go back to these characteristics of God that we're seeing here and remind ourselves that he is in control and we are not. Okay, and then some cross references we have in John 5 where it's talking about judgment. We have Genesis, was talking about the curse of the fall. We have Job in reference to God's sovereignty and providence. James, the Father does not change. He is who he says he is. There's some ones in Psalms that talks about man's body dies, but the soul lives on to eternity. 1 John 2, that desires of our flesh and pride are not from God, but are from the world. And so this difference of what the desires that we are given because of Jesus versus what the flesh is. And so those are some examples of some cross references that can help us think deeply about what the preacher is teaching us. Okay, and so then when you're done with all that, you need to ask yourself, okay, like, how am I seeing Jesus in this? How do I get to Jesus? There's a couple different ways that you can find Jesus in the Old Testament. I would say that one of them here is thinking about looking for a problem that only Jesus can solve. And so some of the things I had written down is that through Jesus, there's this bigger redemptive plan that God is putting in place to make things beautiful, to restore what was lost at Eden. And also as the poem is talking about this course of life, that it all ends in death, like Jesus was subjected to the course of life at an appointed time when it was according to the will of the Father. And how all things are being made beautiful is through Jesus, and through sanctification, redemption, restoration, and final culmination. And then when we talk about this judgment, everything ending in judgment, and how we deal with the injustice and the wrong and the brokenness of this world, that ultimately that judgment of sin was Jesus took that on, and then final judgment will happen at his return, when his kingdom will come. And so those are some ways that I would observe, interpret, and see the gospel in Ecclesiastes 3-4. And I'll go ahead and share with you kind of what my summary was when I was done doing all of those things. Here's what I concluded: that everything under the sun has an appointed time. Every cycle and rhythm and monotonous task is appointed by a sovereign creator who divinely created a cosmic order. And how are we to handle the hopelessness of the monotonous cycle that ends in the grave, that ends in death? By recognizing that God made everything beautiful and man ruined it. We do not know his plans, but we can trust him, so we can eat, drink, and enjoy what we've been given, that we may fear God, because he is a good gift giver, and he has proven that over and over and over again. And then I also made like a little side note that in the face of justice and wickedness, our reality of a monotonous course of life is all culminated in the final judgment. So purpose and meaning and justice will come ultimately. What God made good, man ruined, and God is seeking what has been driven away, and so it'll be brought to its completion through Jesus. And so obviously, as we apply this to our lives, we want to think about the things in this life that we are trying to hold on to, that we're trying to make sense of, that we're trying to be in control of, and we need to wrestle with the fact that we can't be, but God is. Same thing when we struggle with injustice and we struggle with wickedness. We need to look to him for our hope. And so I hope that was helpful. As always, leave in the comments something that you have learned either from this video or just in your own study. Share it. We love to learn from one another. So I'll see you guys next week for week 4.